performance down to the bucket, reducing the stress on the shuttle as it goes transonic.
So no pressure.
Yeah, so I better get it right.
Yeah, no, this will be great. I thought we'd start though, just because the folks that are going to watch this probably, some will know you, but some may not. But maybe just give us just a quick introduction of you, your background, what you're up to, that kind of thing, if you don't mind.
Sure. Okay. So I came from a tiny prairie town called Melville, which had 4,000 inhabitants, counting dogs and chickens. From there, I went to the University of Saskatchewan Regina campus and was one of the first 11 graduates in the first computer science program. Then I accepted an offer to be a graduate student at the University of Alberta, where I studied with a natural language and logic guy called Len Schubert, who eventually moved back to the east to Rochester. And then I went to the University of British Columbia for a PhD studying with Ray Reiter. And so when I finished my PhD, I took a job at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Math. I was one of their first bona fide artificial intelligence hirees. And so it was an uphill battle to sell AI, but it was made easier because I was a formalist in AI. So the mathematicians didn't mind me so much. I wasn't a psychologist, for example.
Right.
And while at Waterloo, a couple of my friends in Palo Alto, one working at Stanford, one working at SRI, convinced me to start a company with them in California. This was the startup phase. So after 5 years at Waterloo, in the heydays, the first heydays in Silicon Valley for AI, in 1986, we started a company that didn't quite start up. So it was whatever you call a company that doesn't quite start. It was kind of like a false start. We did raise $4.5 million from a venture capitalist called J.H. Whitney, who funded things like Memorex, for example. So it wasn't like our ideas weren't successful. It's that the ideas and the flow of cash were contingent on getting a $250,000 project grant from our chief customer, which was United Airlines, to build diagnostic systems for Boeing 737s. When that failed, I moved back to Canada, eventually ending up at the University of Alberta and starting on the momentous day of April 1st, 1987. And in between then and now, I've been seconded and worked in other places. So I was the CEO of a provincial funding agency called ICOR. Then I was the vice president, as you guys know, at AITF for both the Ingenuity and ICOR. I spent years off at the Multimedia University in Malaysia, where I was also CTO of a German software company and built a software development group. I spent a year at the Volkswagen AI group in the global group in Munich. And I spent a year at the University of Tokyo, and I work a lot both in Japan and Germany right now. And most of the trajectory of application is that I'm pretty well known as an AI theoretician, but I like to drive my theoretical colleagues crazy by saying, what is this good for? And the industrial connection to say what parts of it are actually applicable and what can advance industry and society in general is probably what drives the passion. So that's a big thumbnail sketch.
That's you in a nutshell. Not just a few things from a kid from Saskatchewan, eh?
Well, the reason I say that all the time is because I sometimes find people who forget where they came from and they're poorer for it, right? Is that my success comes from the prairie work ethic, right? I was lucky enough to be as bright as most people, but the prairie work ethic said, if you're going to talk about something, don't just talk about it. You'd better do it. Otherwise, you're branded as lazy and charlatan. So
I'm really glad you brought that up, because as you know, this entire little exercise we're undertaking with this podcast is all about discussing potential and those that have potential, either those as individuals or those organizations or companies or what have you, and what it takes. And I mean, you keyed on something that's quite interesting there, which is some humility and some never forgetting your roots and where you come from, which I think if you look at people that have achieved over time, there's a thread there that they're always hungry and they always stay humble. And clearly that's been something that you've embraced through your career.
I've been very lucky to meet larger than expected number of really, really accomplished, smart people. And they all share those two things. First, they will share what they know, typically better than most people. They will share it willingly with anybody and share it in a way so that they can explain anything to anybody. The second thing is the humility. Always be on your guard for learning more, and always believe that there's something you can learn from everyone, and that's a sort of a disposition that I've learned from being very lucky to have good friends and learn from good people.
Well, yeah, and I think that's something that probably drew the three of us together when we worked together at Innovates.
Yes.
Was a keen sense for smelling out bullshit and knowing when you see it,
absolutely,
and not having a lot of tolerance for it. So,
yes. And I think that what I've learned as I've got older, my tolerance for BS isn't any higher than it, or isn't any lower than it was before. But my self-awareness about how to deal with it has improved. So that's a change, because you can reduce the negative impact of BS with a number of tools. The first one isn't usually the right approach. With the Randy approach is that clobbering it doesn't always help, right?
So yeah, absolutely.
One of the I think we all touched on something kind of interesting. One of the things I'm always fascinated about is curiosity, and how curiosity, drives a sort of an incessant need and desire to learn more. One of the things I try to reconcile with AI that can always be a bit confusing is we sort of strip out the human element when we talk about AI, but the quest for curiosity seems to necessitate the involvement of the human. And it seems like we just try to layer on machine learning as though machine learning is going to go and find this curiosity-driven approach to A, finding problems, and B, solving it, when really the human is the integral part in the entire chain.
That's a very interesting kind of what one might observe as sort of philosophical conflict. So restarting from what Lorenzo said about this philosophical, it's not a conflict, it's kind of a conundrum, is if humans, if one of the distinguishing properties is curiosity, and one of the principles of AI seems to be to build intelligence, how do you resolve those two things? And I think that the resolution comes only when we start to admit that more sophisticated versions to answers of the question, like do airplanes fly? Do submarines swim? Do they fly in the same way that we understand how we first thought about flying? Icarus flying too close to the sun and the wax on his feathers melted, for example, or submarines don't seem to have any fins to move about and to propel them, for example. And I think that the more sophisticated version of that emerges in some of the modern conversations that impinge on philosophical things. Good examples are consciousness, for example. And so many AI people will say, oh, well, we're years and years and years and years away from understanding consciousness. The reality is, from the mechanical formal point of view, we already understand that. We can build machines that have representations of themselves, and they can be queried to say, why did you do this? Some of that is inspectable, but whether it's inspectable has to do with the machinery and the resources you produce, not whether consciousness is available or not. So I think curiosity is the same thing. Is what we observe as consciousness and curiosity in humans may just not turn out to be implemented the same way in the abstraction of intelligence. That's all. Not that it's not important, which is perhaps the most important thing, is that those things are important, but they needn't appear or manifest in the same way that they do in the things we observe. For example, flying birds.
What's interesting though, what's interesting about that though is I think your discussion before about how you approach certain problems right now, or how you approach certain people on the BS with the BS meter,
Yes.
I think is key to this point, because there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom. And
Yes.
the thing I wonder about is, even though a machine might understand itself from that perspective, the wisdom, like, because when you talked about BS, it's not that there is or isn't BS. That's a one or zero, sort of answer. It's like, is there or isn't there? But the how to approach the situation, the how to be savvy about it, the how to be graceful in it, those kinds of things.
Yes.
That learning and the application of that skill, which we sometimes package up as wisdom, that's hard. And I think, bringing it back to applications of AI, I mean, one of the things Lorenzo and I experienced with Dave when we were doing our thing with GE was people wanted those one or zero answers, yes or no, right or wrong. And our view always was, we're giving you a signal that indicates something that you can now use to make a decision, but you have to make the decision. The machine's not going to make the decision for you, but it will help inform you, because we're taking very complex data, modeling it together, and then letting you do something with it. But that wasn't good enough for most. For most people, they wanted the simplistic, but no, just tell me yes or no. And it's the funny thing, because, like, just to sort of weave this into sports for a sec, I mean, I think about my son who's currently attending a prep football program out east. One of the things that people have talked about in terms of what the coaches look for successful kids, and this actually came out of a recruiting discussion that we were involved in a few months ago. It was an online Zoom meeting like this with the parents, the kids, and the coaches, talking about college recruiting. And they talked about the little things, like, you're at practice 5 minutes before everybody else is. You're the last guy to leave. If they ask you to run, like 100 meters, you run 110. If they ask you to do, 20 push-ups, you do 21. Like, it's those things. And I was quite taken aback a bit by some of what was discussed, because they talked about a kid, really talented kid, but the kid showed up for practice late. And there were scouts from some big name schools in the US. They wrote him off the list. It's like, hey man, you can't even be here. And so, like, how do you teach that? And I think that's, for me, one of those things that says, I don't know if machines will ever get that intelligent. Like, maybe you have a different opinion, but I do think about how interesting this is when we hear about AI, and I keep thinking, on those basic 1 and 0 tasks, sure. The wisdom pieces that require gut and decision making and instinct, that's harder.
I think that what we observe is that it's harder, and part of it is just because of the nature, I think, of human intelligence is, some of the smartest people we know are successful even when push comes to shove. They make decisions on the seat of their pants by gut instinct. Except I would hypothesize that it's not just a gut instinct, is that they have so much more data to inform their depth of experience that they make the decision. They can't always articulate it in a discrete way, but still they tend to make better decisions. That one of the things that I think about, it was about 1990, around then, when one of my good friends, still a good friend, was a guy named Wolfgang Walster, who was the CEO, the first CEO and CEO for almost 30 years of the German Research Center for AI. And we were having dinner one night in Saarbrücken, and he said, it's just become possible technologically. So this is part of Moore's law in some sense. It's just become possible to argue is that we can store a high definition video of a person's life, the complete life from birth to death. And so when somebody you meet for the first time casually says, oh yeah, I was talking to the chancellor yesterday, you can look back at their record and said, that's bullshit. You weren't talking to the chancellor. We've looked through your whole record. You never talked to the chancellor, right? And that was kind of like one of the things that emerged, is that there was sufficient knowledge capture of this person's experience so that if they said they were drawing on some of their past experience, you could verify it. How they drew on it, back to your question about gut instincts and everything, is not so clear. But I think that that's the basis that leads me to say, well, when I tell you I've made a decision based on my gut instinct, what I'm really telling you is this is what my experience tells me I should decide based on the resources I've used to gather the information I know about and can make explicit.
So yeah, and so in some sense, I guess then it's theoretically possible to be able to mathematically understand that intuition by having the entirety of that data, and then multiplied by having that intuition data across massive populations, could in effect inform the model and help you get a pretty clear and precise understanding of how intuition actually happened.
Well, you're exactly right, because one of the things that's become a hot topic in some circles of AI these days with respect to information extraction from natural language, which you guys already understand, is so-called argument mining. So I'm currently the PI on this big application for $4 million to coordinate people largely interested in the social aspects and the legal aspects of applying AI and natural language to do argument mining. All the way back to your notion of intuition. When somebody does something that we don't understand, we said, why did you decide that? Almost immediately, what they're starting to do is they're trying to fabricate not in a negative sense, but to create an argument that makes sense, that holds together about why they think they made a decision. The argument needn't be correct. It need not even in some cases be logical, but the important point is that there's this effort invested in saying, here's what I think the justification is for making this decision, given what I know I have access to. And I hope you see in my argument justification that there's this series of steps that make sense to any sort of normal observing human being. And I think that that's probably what's becoming much more sophisticated. That's why the study of law is so intriguing, because you're essentially taking everything you know. Judges are particularly interesting to talk to, especially the good ones, because that's what they're doing. They're trying their very best to contextualize the situation that's a legal situation and look for crystal clear arguments about why a decision should come in certain ways.
So let's tie that back, Randy. We talked in the past about, what do you need to have AI? Like what are the conditions? If somebody wants to go down the road and put something together, and we talked about this the last time we chatted, subject matter expertise, et cetera. Do you want to maybe just take us through that and weave it back into this discussion a little bit? Because I think, just to build on that, like I think what you're talking about with intuition is when I hear you describe that, I put myself in the position or think about the person who is that SME, and like the person that knows I'm deciding because of my expertise and all this data I have, some of which has been provided to me, but also my experience and all of those things, which is data, right? It's processing all of that that lets me make a judgment. Right. I then get to say, I think we should do this. Leaders are put in that position all the time, but it's because they're supposed to have a certain level of experience, skill, competency, et cetera, that comes from that lived experience.
Well, in the case, just the way you've articulated, there are successful leaders and unsuccessful leaders, right? And the success is often defined by the current social context of what counts as a positive impact of a leader's decision or a negative aspect of leader's decision. And one of the things that relates it back to the sort of the more mechanical view of AI is that remember in the 50s, the two most important early papers on AI were by Alan Turing and Claude Shannon, mutually discussing the possibility of a machine playing chess. And there, unlike what we are just discussing about the positive outcomes of a leadership decision, there the decisions were really easy to measure. You either won a chess match or you didn't win a chess match, right? So what's changed as AI has progressed? I think it's the acknowledgement and recognition that the choice of what counts as positive performance has become way more complicated, right? And where is it most complicated? Well, I think first steps are in health and in law. That's why we study them as application areas, is that what's elusive but feels within grasp is the measures we take after automating or supporting diagnostic processes for physicians, for healthcare givers. Is maybe the automation improves some of the outcomes that we take at the outset a priori as measures of positive outcome. Similarly, in the cases of law, maybe there we have to be able to do the same thing. So you might wonder now, what colors a judge's decision in the US when they incarcerate more people per capita or in volume, doesn't matter which measure you pick, than any nation on the planet, right? So how have the decisions become out of the decisions regarding interpretation of what's legal become so far out of whack that it's having this kind of a horrible effect on society, for example. So even if it's rational, who knows? But back to those areas, is that the measures of the impact of leaders' decision making is way more complicated than whether or not you won a chess game or a Go game, or even whether the reinforcement learning in a Tesla made a decision that avoided hitting a car that had stopped in front. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So I think what you said about decisions and impact is key as AI becomes more sophisticated, because it's the subject matter expertise articulation of the key performance indicators, if you like, that are way more important.
Well, right. And I mean, I think right now, my observation is people look for two things. They look for data. Do we have data? And then do we have smart, capable computer scientists that have been schooled in this discipline called machine learning or artificial intelligence to do the processing and do the coding? And then they go, okay, we're good. And the piece that people skip over is, hold on, what's the problem you're trying to address and solve?
Exactly.
Really?
Yes.
And who has that required subject matter expertise to define the problem to the computer scientist, and can make sense of the data, even in terms of how you would assemble the data to address the problem in the first place.
Absolutely. I mean, you guys have probably seen this repeatedly, and you sort of have developed your own cookie cutter that is observational cookie cutter that says, oh yeah, I know what they're doing, right? It says the successful people are the subject matter experts who come with this belief that the data that their organization gathers holds way more value for improving decisions than most people recognize. It's up to them to articulate how to measure what would be improvements and how to guide the data scientists to extracting it. Yeah, AI people are a dime a dozen from that point of view, right?
Well, and I think the other challenge that you get is the decision maker, let's say, of the project, who may or may not be the SME, but in most cases isn't, the budget holder, also doesn't necessarily appreciate the complexity of the cleanse, all of it's all like, this is like, the measure 5 times then cut, right? Like the carpenter who over time develops a skill to know what to do before they just start wildly whacking stuff and putting it on the wall. Like to be able to even prepare the ground for a project, the amount of work that's required to even get data organized and clean. And most people in organizations, and Lorenzo's smiling here, I think, is most organizations that we have run into, they don't appreciate the amount of work, the tedious amount of work that may be required to be done before you even start to think about the project. And again, this is like, well, before we, I want to get my wall done. Yeah. Okay. We have to sand the whole thing. And it's going to take like a week. It's like, what do you mean? Like, well, no, we've got to sand and prepare the wall, and we've got to do a lot of work on that. And then, ultimately to throw up the paint or the wallpaper, that might take, a quarter of the time.
Yeah.
But people don't understand the prep work that's required. And sometimes that's another frustration is that can lead to projects going nowhere, even if you do have those other three conditions met. You've got potential for great data, you've got good technical skills, and you've got the SME ready to go.
Yeah. Well, I think that's that's sort of a observation about these milestones in the history of AI, is that the potential for the exploitation of AI and machine learning to help inform better decisions based on more data along that trajectory has become much more complicated than it used to be, right? Just back to consciousness, curiosity, it's easy to decide whether a computer program has beat me in a poker game. That's pretty easy to understand, right? To see how they become better than my best clinical physicians at diagnosing a disease is a way more complicated assessment business.
Jason, you touched on something interesting though around what maybe I'll call technology literacy, and that most people still aren't there yet. And when you brought in the analogy of someone having to sand the walls before doing that work, it's kind of funny because it's almost like if you think a couple generations ago, a lot of people had that skill, like the curve was up here, and it's starting to go down now where a lot of folks don't have those sort of labor related skills. But meanwhile, the technology skills are going like this, and we're probably at a sort of a interesting period in time where we're sort of at the bottom of both. Folks like me didn't grow up with a hammer, but we also didn't necessarily grow up with technology at our fingertips.
Yes.
If I look at my nephews, they're now further up, the curve. They were born with cell phones in their hand, not hammers.
Yeah, exactly.
Those of us that are, 40 to 50 years old are probably sort of stuck in that trough, don't know how to hold a hammer, and weren't born with a cell phone.
Yeah. Well, what do I do with the skill saw, and can I make this sophisticated device do what I want?
Yeah. Well, and I think there's another bigger issue too. And I think that other bigger issue is, what do you value? So think about, Randy, I know you do a lot of work in Japan. So think about Japanese culture versus European culture versus North American culture when it comes to preserving history and heritage. And I think part of what's bastardizing a lot of this too is this relentless focus on outcome versus how you get there, right? So let's take this year's Super Bowl, for example, right? Tom Brady, undoubtedly one of the best football players ever, at 44 or 45 years old, takes these guys basically almost to the show again.
Yes.
Now, they didn't make it there. Another team won the Super Bowl.
Yep.
Does that mean that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are a bad team? And this is the problem right now when you apply this to business, right? It's like, well, we didn't get the outcome we want. And so then everybody starts mixing it up. And it's like, yeah, but maybe you're doing all the right things and you're just not there yet. Maybe market forces haven't let you develop or realize the results. And this relentless focus on outcome instead of the fundamentals of what it takes to get there, I think is another distraction that happens in organizations. So what do you do in that case? Well, it didn't work, so then we try and mix everything up again. Replace so-and-so. You wrote any chemistry that existed amongst team members, you get rid of. Any foundational work, because all of a sudden you build a new playbook, and like the players had just kind of gotten to understand that. And now they have to relearn it all over again. And I think that's another challenge here is, what is the actual KPI at the end of the day that you're measuring? Yes. And I think this can be a huge distraction as well in a lot of these things and in these projects. There's no appreciation for the fundamentals and evaluating if those are sound versus we got it. And you see people taking credit for this all the time. It's like, we're not good, we're lucky. And we put, points on the board, and then they celebrate it like they're really, really good. And anybody that sort of knows what's going on goes, really?
Well, it's like the discussions. You remember the history of the BAMP Venture Forum, which ICOR was closely involved with for several years. And it took me about 30 seconds of listening to addresses by successful entrepreneurs to determine whether they were good or whether they were lucky. And if they couldn't distinguish between those two, then they were not good, right? The brothers were examples of people who made a lot of money by being incredibly lucky at the right time. But one of them would stand up and talk about how clever he was and how everybody had to be as clever as him to be able to be successful. He wasn't clever at all. Right? Give me a break, right? And so that distinction is really important. And in fact, it comes back to two things: humility and time frame. Right? Is that you'll hear people talk about the management of professional sports teams by talking about the quality of the organization, independent of whether they won the Super Bowl last year or the Stanley Cup last year or so on and so forth, right? Is that they attract good people who want to participate in the organization because of how they're treated, what they can contribute to, and how they're part of the overall organization. And so if nothing else, just the time frames of measurement are at least different. You didn't win a Super Bowl. Well, the Toronto Maple Leafs as an NHL team have better support than any other team in the NHL. And they haven't won a Stanley Cup since 1967, for God's sake.
Right.
I've often thought about the Edmonton Oilers and thought, like we had at one point, we had the most losingest or least winningest record of any professional sports team in any sport. Yet we still have 18,000 people at the games and we still had an arena built.
Yeah. And people love them, right?
And people love them. And I couldn't help think to myself, well, if you're in the owner group of a team like that, why would you invest more money on bringing in talent when the talent that you have and what's on the ice is actually bringing in the revenue anyway?
I know. Well,
but here's the flip side. Okay.
Yep.
Remember the dynasty back in whenever it was, the 80s. And then Peter decided to trade Wayne to LA.
Yep.
And what happened? It all fell apart because you took the magic cog out of the machine and the other parts couldn't perform the same way. And so I'm not suggesting one's right and one's wrong, but it depends again on what the metric is. Like the metric is for the owners is bums in seats, keeping my salary cap as low as possible. And making a bunch of money for my investors. Well, then, put the losing team on the ice that everybody still loves, fine. But if the objective is, to get a team that is capable of winning, and then you find the winning formula. So, what did those guys win? 5 cups in 7 years, something like that?
Yeah.
Well, do you want to keep it going? And again, I think what motivated the trade was market value of Gretzky at the time and what that would mean in terms of what, how Pocklington could capitalize on it.
Yeah, because he was already starting to hit his trajectory of all those shyster deals turning south on him. Yeah.
But even in this conversation, like we're getting into some nuance that requires some conversation, right? In terms of saying, well, which one's better?
Absolutely.
Maybe neither one's better. It all depends on your perspective. But that's again that
performance.
Totally. And it's what I think organizations, again, there's too little time paid to this type of conversation. It's just, no, I want this, I want that. And it's like, well, where's the depth of thinking that allows you to frame and contextualize something in a way that then allows you to communicate it to a group of people to achieve something that they are actually aligned to.
Yeah.
And, like there's that old cliche too, right? It's better to be lucky than good. I don't know about that. I mean, I think maybe if you're in Vegas, sure. If you're trying to build something that's sustainable over time, maybe not. Maybe you should focus on being good and
luck as luck. Not the definition is the wrong word, but the observation about whether one is lucky spans a spectrum too. I think about Jason and I don't know, Lorenzo, if you have children or not.
I don't.
Okay, so Jason and I have 8 between the two of us. You have 5, right?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And so when you think about luck, is that I feel lucky to have navigated all of the potential threats to childhood of my 3 children that you no doubt feel the same that way. And is that just a fleeting moment that you were lucky? No, it's compounded luck encouraged by doing our damn best to help our kids avoid scary things and participate in positive things, right? And that happens over a lifetime, not over a football season, for example, or
No, but I think the other interesting point on that is parents having enough courage in the long term to also let their kids fall down once in a while.
Absolutely.
Because I can tell you, like, and I know from our conversations in the past, like I've got kids that have had some challenges. Luckily, they've happened when they've been younger. They haven't impacted them too badly. And the learning has now had them come out the other side in a fairly good way. And as a parent, you do not like to see your kids struggling and suffering and going through that hard time. But on the other hand, it's an incredible learning experience because there's no other way to really get it except to go through it. And it's the same thing with business. Like you mentioned your almost startup back when you did it. How do you get that experience without going through it? And
way to get
it's sort of like, you've got to live through it and you've got to grind, and that those scars do provide you with that. We talked before about curiosity, wisdom, perspective, whatever it is, all of those. I mean, I think it's the curiosity that leads somebody to even want to take that leap. But it's rare that you come out the other end with it's all roses and there was no hardship in it. Usually it's really tough.
Exactly. A good demonstration of that is the current modern attitude towards immunology. So there is a generation, and I'm not sure which generation to label it, that has grown up where you see parents, you must observe this when you're out in public, is parents who are so overly protective of their children. Oh, I just dropped this potato chip on the table. Oh, well, you don't know what's on that table. You better throw it away. Right? As opposed to what somebody described once as the 5-second rule from the prairies. If you drop something on the floor, within 5 seconds, you can pick it up and eat it. I grew up with the 30-second version of that, right? But that's sort of a modern interpretation of finding the right balance of what helps solidify experience in people's decision making. If it's always been easy and you've always been protected, I heard something the other day. There was this brief snippet, I think it might have been on Instagram, of this old black guy said, I worked very hard all my life and now I'm driving a Cadillac. My son will drive a Cadillac. His son will struggle because the expectations cannot be kept up, and then they'll go through another cycle and so on and so forth. And I think that's one of the things we could dampen, we could change, but the cycles seem inevitable somehow.
Well, and I think, go ahead, Lorenzo.
Well, I was just gonna ask, and maybe because I don't have an answer to this either, and so maybe this isn't even just for Randy, but for all three of us, is how do we find that balance with AI of not letting it, take us too far and going into the wrong hands? I mean, it's pretty obvious with kids in a playground. If 100 kids go down the slide, you remember those metal slides kids used to go down, and there were like rivets in the slides, and some kids would burn themselves and some kids would cut themselves. It becomes pretty obvious that you need to do something about that. In the world of AI, it's a lot less obvious. It's still pretty Wild West, right? I don't know where the balance of this stuff's going too far is, and how far does it have to go before we, feel like we need to reel it back and go.
Let's talk about that.
I'm just going to get you a book that's on my bookshelf that friend just gave me.
Well, Randy's doing that. Let's talk a bit about that and I hope he can still hear me.
Sure.
Yeah, I sent out a tweet today because did you guys see the article in I forget, it's all over in Ontario, but I guess there's some students now, because they've dropped the mask mandate.
Yes.
Protesting that. How dare the government get rid of masks? And I sit back and I go, okay, this is students. Like you guys are like 18 to 22, let's say.
Yes.
The data suggests you're fine. By and large, the majority of you, like 99 point a bunch out of 100 of you, which is basically everybody, with the odd exception, is fine. And you think, how can these kids be this upset about it? And again, it shows, like, despite the data and the modeling and all the stuff, and I mean, there's all the stuff coming out now about how much of that might have been manipulated or whatever, but notwithstanding that, if you look at what's coming out as fact, The fact is, people in that age group and age
Yep.
category,
Yep.
by and large, have had really no issues and nothing to worry about. And the other thing I would say is most of those kids are probably also immunized. So if you
Yep.
believe in vaccines and you believe that the virus isn't a big deal and all the rest of it, why are you upset?
Yeah.
But it's totally illogical. And
There's a
layer
lot
on
of-
now some machine learning on top of that, or some AI. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I think that's related to what I'll tell you about this book in a second. But another person, so you know Don Back, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I have lots of conversations still with Don because he's a smart guy and I always admire his perspective. But we were talking the other day. I said, so if you interviewed 100 of the freedom fighting truckers, how many of them would be able to say what they're fighting against? And Don said, none, which is making exactly the point is that there is this momentum of protest that seems to be a kind of false social license that those kids when 18 to 22 think they have the license to protest. They have to have something to bring them into coherence to protest about it. Matters little whether it's sensible or not.
Yeah, that's the scary part, though, is if that is your source of data, and
And
then
you're
you start
amplifying
modeling it up and you amplify it, it gets a bit scary.
Yeah. Well, I gave a talk to lawyers and judges at the Alberta Law Society annual dinner about 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, and they wanted me to talk about this book because they thought the topic they selected that they wanted me to talk about was what I thought about this book and how or whether this book made any sense. So the bottom line on this book with this guy as the lead author, I studied and learned a lot about him. I don't know if I said this last time, but Kissinger is an incredibly smart guy, but an incredibly nasty guy. I wouldn't trust him with anything ever, right? But the premise of the book is another sort of misconception in a way. And the conception of these two guys, I know Eric Schmidt and have met him. I haven't met Kissinger. And I haven't met the chair. The last guy's name as a co-author is supposed to give them credibility. He's currently the chairman of computer science at MIT and did computer vision work, for example. But the premise about their fear that the chicken little sky is falling view of AI is just cast in the wrong way. Is obviously from what I read about Kissinger, he leads this, but he says we really have to worry about AI being used in a way that accelerates the targeted deployment of weapons. And it's something that you would understand from a guy like Kissinger. Is a wholly right-wing approach to the my guns have to be more powerful than yours, but you're not allowed to have powerful weapons sort of point of view. But it misses the whole point because the conception of his use of AI is its use in conventional warfare, and that, oh yes, we'll have smarter, faster drones that will be controlled by people on the ground, and we don't want AI to take over the world that way. Then Putin invades Ukraine, right? And what do we see? We see the same old shit, right? We see Ukrainian babas with Molotov cocktails slowing or stopping the whole Russian military machinery, right? And so,
it's funny. I remember reading something about the capabilities of different armed forces, and they said one of the things about the U.S. and no question it's the world's greatest fighting force right now. But they said the thing about American soldiers are they're specialists. They're highly specialized at what they're trained in.
Yeah.
But if you ask them to do something that's outside of that specialization, they're kind of lost. Versus, let's say, Canadian soldiers. Yes. And look at our military budget; it's nothing on a relative basis. But because we don't have a whole lot, people have to figure out how to do things with a lot less. And so you, out of necessity, gain experience and adaptability and ways to probably be a lot more effective in a variety of different other environments if you
Yes.
remove the technology, if you remove the tools because
Yes.
of that necessity. And your point about the fact that an entire country of Ukraine with
Yep.
homemade Molotov cocktails and other very crude
Yep.
weaponry can even resist the way they have. Whether or
Yeah.
not they'll win, I mean, we'll see.
Yep.
But the fact that they can resist and inflict this kind of damage
Yep.
on what should be a superior military force is quite amazing. And
Yep.
again, it speaks back to,
Yep.
blind faith in technology will probably only lead to blindness
Yeah.
if you don't
Yeah.
layer in some other pieces.
Well, one of the things that I think we learn from that is that people's resolve for the KPIs that are important to them is much more important than the tools they have to achieve them, right?
Mhm.
Back to what Lorenzo said about a hammer is, oh, we have our hammers, but boy, we're not giving up on our KPIs, right?
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
and then that's compounded when we lay over, individual CEO performance bonuses, let's say on a select handful of KPIs that then just become so myopic in that individual's view that you can't even think about straying off it to find what would be maybe a better 5-year outcome,
Yes.
but it's not supported by a 9 to 12-month outcome.
Yes, and in fact, that part of that is why I like the sociologists that I know that are scientists is an attempt to take a step back and say, how do leadership decisions propagate through history? I'll give you an example. Is that one of the first trips I made to Chinese universities in the mid 80s. The first time I taught an AI course was in Harbin, but I visited Beijing as well. And I developed enough respect so I could ask questions like this of my Chinese academic colleagues. And I'll never forget the answer from one of them. I said, well, so what do you think about the impact of the Cultural Revolution, the second of Mao's revolutions? And he just looked at me in the eye and he said, it's too early to tell, right? So such a deep ideological exercise with deep ramifications of propagating through society, not for 10 days or 10 years, but for hundreds of years. Just that's what he said. It's very hard to tell whether the reset then academically, closing down all universities and then rebuilding them, is that a good thing? He said, too early to tell. So I think that that's partly related to this notion of accelerated or not value of AI and machine learning. Building abstractions and models to make predictions from data is one thing. A conversation I had with people from Roche and University College London this morning was to ask the question about what tools do we need in place to mitigate exactly this. So for example, in this idea of distributed databases and federated learning, what tools do we have to ensure we understand bias when you combine two health data sets? Well, for the most part, it's all the way back to what you said about SME saying, oh, I've got this data, I'm going to sprinkle some magic AI sauce and then everything will be better, right? But the point is like if you're a good cook, you're not a good cook because you knew how to read the recipe book. You're a good cook because you've experimented with a whole variety of methods and substances, and you know how to develop something that will have the properties you want. So I think that that's a real danger with AI is rapid adoption of bad methods too early.
Yeah,
Randy,
go ahead.
Sorry, Lorenzo. I was just going to say, when you look out there at what's going on in this field right now,
yep,
and you see, like who's doing it really well, who sticks out in your mind? Like, do you see organizations or jurisdictions or places where it's like they've got a lot of the right components, they're doing a lot of the right things, and what is it about those places or organizations that is leading to that level of achievement, right?
that's a good question, and I guess I see this go in cycles, but let me talk about the 80s and the resurgence from the 50s and the 80s from American style Stanford school AI and expert systems was one thing. But almost at the same time, the Japanese fifth generation project, and followed closely by the 10 years real world computing projects, had one profound difference. And that is that the Japanese were talking about democratizing access to knowledge, and the Americans were talking about creating return for shareholders. Right? And those are fundamentally different KPIs at the outset, and I think that's partly how you see these cycles. So who is leading right now? What's emerging are the groups that are saying it's. I don't always agree with the sky is falling metaphors from people who are criticizing AI as be wary AI is going to take over the world and pull the plugs on humans. So that's pretty easy to disagree with. But the Open AI Institute, although like the Schwartz Reisman Institute at U of T, led by Gillian Hadfield, a few in Europe, AI collaborations are seriously promoting the priorities of good for mankind and good for society, and they get lots of BS charlatans. The time is always right for those people who are making names for themselves with sort of shallow interpretations of this because they can get an audience. But I think that those are what you see. I'll give you an example. So Cynthia Rudin is a young woman professor at Duke University, and I have a lot of respect for her because somehow she doesn't buy into the standard deep learning, reinforcement learning litany. Most of what she's written about is to say how we can build transparent systems without blindly accepting this trajectory that actually most people don't buy in anymore. Everything can be done with neural networks. Same is true of a guy named Rich Caruana at Microsoft Research. Says, well, maybe you can build a classifier predictor really quickly using some PyTorch and other kinds of neural network models. But if you actually want to understand them, that might not be the way you want to build them. So, but most of those people are driven by the challenge of doing things for society. There's another one that I've been looking at, trying to help Huawei with their the three thrusts of their 6G AI thing, which is, excuse me, Internet of Things, sensors everywhere, rapid communication, building models, and trust. And so this is one of the things that crosses my desk. And it's not because it's the best, but it's an academic who's a computer scientist that asks the question, what does it mean to build an ethical algorithm? And he doesn't have a lot. I mean, it's not that he doesn't have some things wrong, at least from my experience. But what he does is exposes the need to talk about considering the knockoff propagation properties of building something in a certain way. And you guys have direct experience with this when you think about observations of bias in HR interviews, for example, right? All the way back to that.
Yep.
And I think that that's what's changing. There are a few people around the world who, when driven by a need to prioritize measuring positive impact on society, beginning to rethink how to deploy things, unlike Kissinger and his friends, right? Their assumption with their knowledge is that the whole world is out to, my bomb's going to be smarter than your bomb. I mean, that's their fear, right?
So you know what's interesting, what you just discussed, it reminds me of something. We put a little model together. This is a number of years ago with a client we were working on, and their CEO asked me to come in, and we had about 40 of their executives and senior managers in the room over a course of a couple of days, working through some stuff on them. And he wanted me to talk about leadership.
Yep.
And again, this whole thing of what is leadership, I find a fascinating question because you'll get a different answer depending on who you ask.
Yes.
And, you know, the classic one is while they achieve the outcome. And so I thought, well, yeah, it's a bit more nuanced than that. And so to be controversial and get everybody thinking,
Yep.
in this part of the presentation, I threw up a picture of Hitler.
Whoa,
And,
this is funny because I've done exactly the same thing in a leadership presentation. Yep.
Right. And I said, good leader. I asked the group, good leader or bad leader?
Yep.
Like, by show of hands. And it was interesting because we kind of had this sort of mixture of people, it was sort of half and half.
Yeah.
And then I said, okay, but think about this. Like, for those of you that said he was a good leader, why did you say that? Yep. And a lot of the answers had to do with, achieve the objective, look at what he did to rally a whole group of people around and blah, blah, blah. And then the other people said, yeah, but he was a horrible guy and all the rest of it. And so I put up a model. It was a, sort of like a 2x2 grid, but it was basically achievement on one axis, but it was almost sort of like benefit or damage to the team on the other axis, or the people. And it was like, where would you ultimately like to be? Because I could argue Hitler is out here on achievement, but in terms of like net ethical or moral or whatever, he's way down here. And think about, people that lead from position, like there are people that will lead because they have authority, they have the title or they have the rank or they have, the role. But there's also people that are really effective that people want to follow that have none of that. And I said the most effective ones are the ones that have both. They're responsible for leading that group, but the people respect them and they want to follow them. And yes, they all are also able to deliver good outcome, but that's not necessarily at the expense of the other pieces. And it got everybody thinking, but I think that's a bit of what you were just touching
absolutely
on, right?
Clear. I used exactly those examples in a talk I gave to the Alberta Teachers Association once. They wanted me to talk about leadership, and so you could see the pause in the audience when I put up a picture of Hitler in the same way, and I said exactly what you just said. And the other thing I learned, there was a psychologist, cognitive psychologist, AI guy that U of A worked very hard to recruit from Queen's University, an Italian, Terry Caeli, and he was recruited to U of A as the chairman of psychology. And he so alienated the whole department that the dean then, this is psychology as a science faculty department, the dean didn't know what to do, but he really didn't like how the old entrenched psychologists were reacting to what he hired Caeli for, was to change things. And so he said, I'm at my wit's end. I can't do anything. Randy, will you take Terry as a faculty member in computing science? And I said, yes, of course. He's a good scientist and he knows what he's doing. So we moved him. But the provost at the time said the following. He said, independent of why the psychologists didn't want him as a chair because he was changing too many things too quickly or something like that, Doug Orem then was the provost, and he said, you're not a leader if nobody follows you, or nobody will follow you. So back to your point on that spectrum of where you want to be, is you need people to want to follow, and you need to be able to have sufficient authority, whatever it is, to be able to enact some change.
Well, and the big question behind what you just said is the why question. Why are they following you? Are they following you under threat of death or jail time, or withdrawal of all assets from one's possession, or insert that thing here? Or are they following you because you have, and I'll use a cliche, but you have won their hearts and minds. They do trust you. They do believe in you. They are committed to the mission, and they realize that outcome be damned, there will be wins and losses, but they're still with you. And like that to me is magic if you can get that happening.
So I met
inside of an organization.
I agree. One of the guys I was lucky enough to meet, that was the prime minister, the long-term prime minister of Malaysia, Mohammed Mahathir. So he was prime minister when I moved to Malaysia, and then when he retired, he saw this sense of corruption taking over, and then he came back at 80 years old and won another election. But he was a physician. At the time of Malay's independence from Britain, He saw all of the negative parts of the colonialism, and he just decided, he said, the only way to fix this is to have a heavy hand in favor of doing things for the people, right? So the external world saw him as a fascist dictator of a Muslim country. In fact, he was the only Muslim country that was actually progressing. So what did he do? He created the health system. What else did he do? He supported and elaborated the education system. Malaysia is still one of the few places outside of the United Kingdom where if you get a medical degree, you're eligible to practice in the UK, for example. He built industry. So two of the biggest car industries in Southeast Asia come from Malaysia. On and on and on it goes. But he was considered by sort of negative Western reporters as being a fascist. In fact, he was a kind man who had sufficient authority and fellowship that he could make decisions to change things.
Well, I think Nelson Mandela was viewed a bit like that too originally, right?
Absolutely.
When he came in,
Yes. Yep.
You know, what's going on here? But then the stories of the man now, as he got on in life and, you know, came out of jail and all the rest of it, were quite different. But I think that also speaks, it's interesting, it speaks to what lens are you applying to that problem, yours or the people on the ground? I mean, even the situation in Ukraine right now, I find fascinating if you look at the different reporting from different regions around the world and the kinds of stories that are getting reported. Lorenzo mentioned to me, I think it was last week, he was looking at something, I think out of one of the Middle Eastern news services that on balance seemed actually fairly balanced.
Yes.
Probably because in the fight, they actually are a bit more neutral maybe than say people in the US or
less
Europe.
polarized for sure, yes.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I read one just a little while ago that I sent to Don Beck. It's a story. It said, a Russian in Moscow walks up to the local news vendor, pays him for a newspaper, picks it up and throws it back and doesn't read it. Next day, he comes back, picks up a paper, looks at it, throws it back, doesn't read it. Third day, he comes back and the news vendor says, how come you're buying this paper? You look at the front page and throw it out. You don't look at it. And the man says, he said, well, I'm looking for an obituary. And the news vendor says, the obituaries are never on the front page. And the man says, the one I'm interested in will be.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Listen, maybe just a couple of final thoughts from you, Randy, are on what are you doing? What's next for you? What's sort of keeping you busy? What are you excited about? Because you're still developing your potential. I mean, you're still going 100 miles an hour. And
yeah, I am. I think I learned. So you saw me on a trajectory when we first met. You saw me on a trajectory coming out of I-Corps, which was an incredible organization where a relatively high-performing academic could find satisfaction in how to turn that experience into sort of positive investment, because at that time, the provincial government trusted me enough to report and develop KPIs of investing their money into recruiting people to Alberta to do research where they actually could see that it was having an impact. And then you know as well as I do what happened at Alberta Innovates. The Doug, what was the minister's name? Doug Horner's intention, I thought, was actually noble to economize by consolidating science and research investment in a way that would help it achieve more than it could being sprinkled across the health and the science and engineering and ICT areas. But as we all know, the way it was implemented really killed it. But for me, and the answer to the question going forward is that the I-Corps job was essentially a science politics administrative job. And it turned, not by my own doing, into the 5 years at AI at Alberta Innovates. And when I left there, I said, I've accrued a lot of experience that can be really useful in senior administration at U of A. That's when the then VPRI, Lauren Babiak, said, he gave me a task, said, if you can do this, we'll hire you. So I ended up being there 6 years. 5 of them were really good because I continued all of my research. In fact, I was on average publishing more papers than my colleagues who weren't in senior administration, than my regular colleagues. Now, to their credit, teaching takes a lot of energy, so I understand that, right, the trade-off. But the last VPRI is a piece of work, and I'm so glad to be out of there, and that means I've recalibrated. So what am I recalibrating? Well, research is the fun part, right? But research without application is not fun. I can sit and invent new things with a piece of paper and a pencil by myself. And so taking this year off has meant I'm learning an incredible amount by working with 2 or 3 external companies as a consultant. So after all, who has 40 years experience professionally in AI and can still talk without needing a breath? Not very many people is what it comes down to, right? And so I'm reinvigorated to say, gee, as a kid, all the way back from being a kid from the town of 4,000 counting dogs and chickens, maybe I finally reached an inflection point where the experience I've accrued, if I'm careful and work hard, can actually be translated to value for others. And that's what I'm having fun doing right now. It's so much fun to go talk to people and not feel the need to promote my own individual research. I'll say general things about where good and bad research is being done. I mean, implicitly, I hope I'm doing good research, but I'm not the only one. But I get to say that without needing to publish a paper next week.
It's funny you mentioned that. Lorenzo and I have been talking for a long time. Like, we've been at this now for 13 plus years.
Yep.
And we get to see all kinds of different organizations and all kinds of different people, and get to go in trying to add some value and help them, be a little bit better for our involvement once we're gone than, before we were there. And it is extremely rewarding because you get to learn the entire time you're doing the work.
Yep.
And you get to see a lot of the same challenges and issues, but nuanced and wrapped in different packaging. But it is extremely rewarding work. So I'm happy to hear that you're finding the same thing out there when you're doing what you're doing.
And I'm finding that in this year in particular. So getting the year off and being able to decide on my own means I've done one thing that you guys wouldn't be surprised about. I'm still as busy as I ever was. I still say yes too often. I'm starting to say no a little bit more often. But the other thing is that I'm being paid pretty well for 2 or 3 of the consulting gigs. And now I change my priorities about where I'll invest effort. So I'm learning more about this stuff I've showed you books on my desk about in support of Roche and Huawei and a few others. I'm learning more about things where I don't have to be driven by getting the next paper out.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And the other thing that's really pretty cool, if there's one positive to have come out of the pandemic, it's in some ways living in this virtual world affords you some of those opportunities in terms of time. I had a meeting the other day that, normally would have necessitated a commute time that would have basically been, an entire morning and a lunch for only 2 hours of meetings. And instead I was able to, read a book, learn about Stoicism, have a conversation with Jason, have a coffee, and have 2 meetings. In the same 5-hour chunk.
Well, I'm thinking about that now as I've been navigating all of the requirements for this trip to Japan. And I've almost reached the threshold of maybe I don't want to go, right? As all of the formal requirements in the current conditions of the world to be able to do this. So last week, Thursday, I had to drive all the way to Calgary to be in person for an interview for the visa under the pandemic situation. And even though it's been relaxed, I still had to be there person to person. I have to fill out all these forms. I have to get all of these tests. I have to do this, and this. Now, the good news is that when everything is as is going now, I can go to Narita, and if I pass the antigen test, having all of the other documentation I have, I can get on public transit and work as I always did in Tokyo. Not everybody is so lucky. But the overhead of arranging all that, I just found out this morning that in the time I will be there from April 9th till May 8th, there are 5 national holidays. That's great because NII will still pay me a per diem on the national holidays. But But one starts to think about exactly that is the added value. Now, one of the added values is to work directly with my colleague Ken Sato. He and I are really the two that put together this international consortium on argument mining from legal documents, for example. And so the decision about us getting that money will happen maybe by the end of April, but we have sufficient information from the jurisdictional agencies that it looks pretty good. So now we have to start planning how to manage a $4 million project over 3 years with academics from Germany, France, England, Canada, and the UK, Japan. So this is a great opportunity. So it's going to be worth it, but it's exhausting, right?
Yeah, right on. Good to see you, Randy.
Thanks a lot, guys.
All
Good
the
luck
best.
with it.
Yeah, take care. Bye.
Bye.